Cambodia-Vietnam border region, May 2nd, 1968, 1400 hours. The jungle west of Loc Ninh was not just a location, it was a weapon. To the soldiers of the North Vietnamese Army's 320th Division, this terrain was home, and it was their greatest ally. They had spent months preparing this kill zone. They knew every ravine, every heavy thicket of bamboo, and every sight line. They had moved an entire infantry battalion, nearly 1,000 men, into position with the silence of ghosts. They were heavy with Soviet-supplied weaponry, AK-47 assault rifles, RPD machine guns, and RPG-7 launchers. Their objective was simple, relying on the classic hammer and anvil tactic. They had detected a small American reconnaissance team insert into the area. Standard procedure dictated that the Americans, likely a 12-man Special Forces patrol, would be disoriented, outnumbered, and quickly annihilated. The NVA commander, positioned on a ridge overlooking the dense canopy, checked his watch. The trap was sprung. The ambush was initiated with a ferocity designed to leave no survivors. From the perspective of the NVA command, the engagement began exactly as planned. The initial volley of fire was overwhelming. The American radio chatter, intercepted by signals intelligence units, was frantic. The patrol was pinned down, taking casualties immediately. The NVA commander watched the green smoke of the jungle floor mix with the grey smoke of cordite. By all conventional military logic, the fight should have lasted 10 minutes. The sheer volume of fire directed into that small pocket of resistance was enough to shred the vegetation itself. But 10 minutes passed, then 20, then 30. The reports coming back to the NVA command post were confusing. The American unit was not dead, they were not surrendering, and they were not running. They were holding a perimeter so tight and so violent that the NVA assault squads were being repelled time and again. But this was not the mystery. Good soldiers fight hard. The NVA respected that. The mystery began when the sky started to churn. The sound of American helicopters, the distinct whop, whop of the Bell UH-1 Iroquois, signaled an extraction attempt. The NVA had anticipated this. They had set up heavy machine gun nests specifically to create a wall of lead in the sky. The air was thick with tracer fire. Several helicopters attempted to land, only to be driven off by the intensity of the barrage. The NVA commander nodded. The trap was holding. No one could get in, and no one could get out. And then, the anomaly occurred. One helicopter, ignoring the wall of anti-aircraft fire, dove toward the kill zone. It took hit after hit, the fuselage sparking as rounds tore through the thin metal skin. It didn't hover for a graceful landing. It practically crashed into the scrub brush. The NVA soldiers trained their weapons on the open doors, expecting a squad of fresh infantry to pour out, or perhaps just to see the crew decimated. Instead, the reports from the forward observers described something that made no tactical sense. A single figure emerged. He was not moving with the caution of a soldier entering a hot landing zone. He was sprinting. But what confused the NVA marksman was that this figure appeared to be unarmed. He carried a medical bag in one hand and a knife in the other. He ran straight into the wall of fire that had just forced armored gunships to retreat. The NVA infantry opened up. At that range, with that volume of fire, the figure should have been cut in half before his boots hit the mud. He didn't fall. An NVA squad leader, crouched behind a fallen teak log, watched in disbelief. He saw the American take a hit. The impact of a 7.62mm round is unmistakable. It carries enough kinetic energy to knock a man off his feet. The figure stumbled, clearly struck, but he did not stop. He picked himself up and continued running toward the trapped patrol. This was the first crack in the NVA's understanding of the situation. In war, men die when they are shot. It is a universal constant. But on that afternoon in May 1968, that constant seemed to be suspended. Before we unravel the terrifying sequence of events that followed, and how this single anomaly would baffle Soviet intelligence analysts for years to come, subscribe to Cold War Impact to uncover the hidden histories and tactical mysteries that defined the 20th century. The confusion on the ground began to turn into a localized panic. The single figure reached the trapped patrol. Instead of hunkering down, he began to move among them, dragging men, distributing ammunition, and effectively seizing command of the chaos. The NVA commander ordered a mortar strike. The dull thumps of the tubes firing were followed seconds later by earth-shattering explosions inside the American perimeter. Shrapnel tore through the trees. Surely now they were finished. The smoke cleared. The single figure was still moving. For the Soviet military advisors who would later analyze the after-action reports of this engagement, this specific time frame between 1400 and 1600 hours presented a significant problem. The Soviet doctrine of warfare was based on mathematics and material superiority. You calculate the number of rifles, the rate of fire, the terrain modifiers, and you get a predicted outcome. The equation in Loc Ninh was broken. The NVA battalion was pouring thousands of rounds per minute into an area no larger than a tennis court. They were firing RPGs into the tree line. They were flanking from 3 sides. And yet, the return fire from the American position was becoming more organized, not less. The Ghost, as some of the NVA soldiers began to refer to him in the heat of the moment, was everywhere at once. A sniper put a round through him. He kept moving. A grenade fragment tore into his back. He kept moving. He was seen physically lifting wounded men who were heavier than him and carrying them to the waiting helicopter, shielding their bodies with his own. To the NVA soldiers, this behavior was terrifying because it suggested that their weapons were ineffective. There is nothing more demoralizing to an infantryman than watching an enemy absorb lethal force and continue to fight. It breaks the psychological will to engage. Reports began to filter back to the command post that the Americans had deployed a new type of soldier, perhaps chemically enhanced, perhaps armored in a way that was invisible to the naked eye. The chaos escalated when the extraction helicopter, the one the Ghost had loaded with the wounded, attempted to take off. The NVA focused every gun they had on it. The pilot was hit. The helicopter crashed, upside down, a twisted wreck of metal and fuel. "They are finished," the NVA commander stated. "Move in, kill the survivors." This should have been the end. The Americans were wounded, crash-landed, surrounded, and outnumbered 50-1. The NVA infantry rose from their concealed positions to deliver the final coup de grace. They moved in for the kill, bayonets fixed, expecting to find broken bodies. Instead, the Ghost crawled out of the wreckage. He was bleeding from a dozen wounds. He had no rifle. And yet, as the NVA infantry closed in, he organized the survivors into a defensive perimeter around the crash site. He called in airstrikes on his own position, the coordinates so close that the NVA attackers were vaporized, while the Americans huddled in the mud. The NVA radio channels became a cacophony of screaming, "The target is still active! We cannot kill him! The artillery is hitting us!" The stakes for the NVA, and by extension, their Soviet backers, suddenly shifted. This was no longer about wiping out a reconnaissance team. It was about containing a myth in the making. If this story got out, if the American military could produce soldiers who could single-handedly hold off a battalion while wounded, unarmed, and crashed, the psychological impact would be devastating. The Soviet advisors in Hanoi would later demand to know what technology was used. Was it a new combat drug? A prototype body armor? They needed to know why a battalion of hardened veterans couldn't kill one man in the middle of a jungle clearing. As the sun began to dip lower, casting long, jagged shadows across the blood-soaked clearing, the NVA commander made a desperate decision. He would not rely on bullets anymore. He ordered a mass human wave assault. They would overrun the position by sheer weight of numbers. They would trample the Ghost into the mud. Hundreds of NVA soldiers rose up, screaming, and charged the wreckage. They expected to find a dying man. What they found instead was a level of violence that defied description. The mystery of the Ghost of Loc Ninh was not just that he survived, it was that he was waiting for them. Hanoi, North Vietnam. Military Intelligence Directorate. 72 hours post-engagement. The jungle floor at Loc Ninh had gone silent, but the noise was just beginning in the sterile, windowless briefing rooms of Hanoi. The after-action report from the 320th Division had arrived, and it was immediately flagged as anomalous. To the Soviet military advisors and senior NVA strategists reviewing the file, the document read less like a military debriefing and more like a work of hysterical fiction. The numbers simply did not align with the laws of physics or probability. A full-strength NVA infantry battalion, entrenched in heavy cover, had engaged a small reconnaissance element. The Americans were outnumbered nearly 10-1 initially, and then, as reinforcements failed, the ratio had climbed to something approaching 100-1 against the single rescue element on the ground. The Soviet liaison officer, a man trained in the rigid mathematical doctrine of the Red Army, stared at the casualty figures. The NVA had suffered devastating losses. Entire squads had been wiped out. The kill zone was littered with the bodies of North Vietnamese soldiers. And yet, the confirmed kills column for the American side was negligible. The investigation began not with a hunt for the man, but with a hunt for the lie. The Soviet advisors were convinced that the NVA field commander was lying to cover up his own incompetence. They believed he must have stumbled into a trap, perhaps an entire American company lying in wait. They assumed the single soldier story was a fabrication designed to excuse a tactical disaster. Teams were sent to interview the survivors of the 320th Division. These were hardened veterans, men who had fought the French and had spent years in the jungle. They were not prone to exaggeration, but their testimony was consistent, and it was terrifying. It was one man, a wounded platoon leader, reported from a field hospital, his eyes wide, staring at the ceiling. "He ran through the claymores. He ran through the machine gun fire. We hit him. I saw him bleed. But he did not stop." The investigators pressed for details on the weaponry. Had the Americans deployed a new tank? A localized nerve gas? No, the survivors insisted. He used a knife. He used our own AK-47 rifles against us. He used the radio. This specific detail, the radio, became a focal point of the Soviet analysis. According to the timeline reconstructed by intelligence, the American Ghost had been on the ground for 6 hours. For the vast majority of that time, he was directing air support. This required cognitive clarity. It required the ability to read a map, calculate coordinates, and speak clearly over the roar of battle. However, the medical evidence gathered from the blood trails and the descriptions of the Ghost's injuries made this cognitive function impossible. The investigation team consulted with trauma surgeons. They presented a hypothetical scenario based on the witness accounts. Subject A, the intelligence officer posited, has sustained a gunshot wound to the leg, a grenade fragment to the back, a gunshot wound to the stomach, and supposedly a bayonet slash through the arms. Is this subject capable of calling in precision airstrikes? The surgeons were unanimous. No. At that level of trauma, the human body enters hypovolemic shock, blood pressure drops, the brain is starved of oxygen, fine motor skills vanish. Coherent speech becomes impossible. The subject would be comatose, if not dead. Therefore, the Soviet conclusion remained that the Americans had introduced a new variable. The Ghost could not be a standard human soldier. The investigation shifted to technological explanations. This was the era of the space race, of rapid advancement in military hardware. Rumors began to circulate within the intelligence community about American super soldier programs. They looked at the pharmacological angle. Had the CIA developed a combat stimulant that overrode the body's shutdown mechanisms? A drug that could keep a soldier fighting even as he bled out? If true, this was a strategic catastrophe for the Eastern Bloc. If the United States could inject a platoon of men with this substance and drop them into North Vietnam, the numerical advantage of the NVA would be nullified. A zombie army that didn't feel pain and didn't die would break the morale of the communist forces within months. The paranoia deepened when the NVA recovered physical evidence from the crash site where the extraction helicopter had gone down. They found blood gallons of it, soaking the soil and the twisted metal of the fuselage. It was Type O. It was human. But there was too much of it for one man to lose and walk away. The Soviet analysts looked at the impossible event from Part 1 the moment the Ghost had charged the NVA line to drag the wounded to safety. They calculated the weight he was carrying. An unconscious American soldier with gear weighs nearly 200 pounds. The Ghost, according to visual estimates, was of average build. To lift that weight, while suffering from abdominal gunshot wounds, which compromised the core muscles needed for lifting, defied biomechanics. The investigators began to build a file labeled with a code name, treating this single entity as a classified weapon system rather than a person. They analyzed the bayonet incident. NVA reports stated that during the final human wave assault, an NVA soldier had successfully closed the distance and stabbed the Ghost with a bayonet. This is a killing blow. It is intimate and final. The report stated that the Ghost did not just survive the stab, he pulled the bayonet out of his own body, killed the attacker with his combat knife, and continued to organize the defense. This specific incident rippled through the NVA ranks as a horror story. It transformed the Ghost from a soldier into a demon. Political officers had to work double time to quell the rumors. They told the troops it was propaganda, that the Americans were weak and soft. But the men of the 320th Division knew better. They had seen the demon. By the end of the week, the investigation had reached a disturbing impasse. They had ruled out a secret platoon. No extra footprints, no extra gear found. They had ruled out mass hallucinations, too many corroborating witnesses. They were left with the wrong conclusions, the only ones that fit their materialist worldview but failed to capture the spirit of the event. The American had been wearing a prototype exoskeleton or armor under his uniform, unproven. The American was high on a sophisticated experimental amphetamine, plausible but unproven. The entire event was a massive deception operation, using sound effects and pyrotechnics to simulate a larger force, highly unlikely given the casualties. The Soviet command in Moscow demanded a name. They needed to know who this weapon was. They needed to know if he had been mass-produced. Was he a graduate of a special program? Was he a genetic outlier? While the Soviets hunted for a technological explanation, chasing shadows of drugs and armor, they were missing the reality entirely. They were looking for a thing, a product of science. They didn't realize that the weapon they were terrified of was currently lying in a hospital bed in Saigon, tagged as deceased, his body covered in a sheet, waiting to be zipped into a body bag. The investigation had failed to identify the source because the source had ceased to exist on any official roster. The ghost was effectively dead. And this administrative error on the American side would inadvertently protect the secret for decades. But the legend was already cemented. In the classified archives of the NVA, the Battle of Loch Ninh was marked with a special asterisk. It was the day the math failed. It was the day a single American Green Beret held off a battalion, not with a superweapon, but with something the Soviet doctrine could not quantify, a refusal to die. Quan Loi Base Camp, South Vietnam, May 2nd, 1968, 13:30 hours. While the Soviet analysts in Hanoi were concocting theories about experimental drugs and exoskeletons, the reality of the situation was unfolding in a prayer room at a forward operating base. The secret project the Soviets feared was not a government program. It was a 32-year-old man named Roy Benavidez. And the most terrifying detail for the enemy, had they known it, was that this weapon system wasn't even supposed to be in combat. Roy Benavidez was a master sergeant in the U.S. Army Special Forces, the Green Berets. But on this specific afternoon, he was strictly non-combatant. He was off-duty. He was wearing civilian clothes. He had recently returned from a previous tour where he had stepped on a landmine. Army doctors had told him he would never walk again. He had rebuilt his body through sheer, agonizing force of will, doing push-ups in the dark of night to prove the doctors wrong. He walked with a stiffness that he hid from his commanding officers. This was the super soldier the Soviets were hunting, a man who had already been broken and pieced back together. The incident began not with a tactical order, but with a radio frequency. Benavidez was monitoring the radio when he heard the frantic distress calls from the 12-man Special Forces team trapped near the Cambodian border. The call sign was O2. The voice on the other end was screaming, "Get us out of here! For God's sake, get us out of here!" The panic in that voice triggered something in Benavidez that no Soviet training manual could quantify. It wasn't political indoctrination, it wasn't hatred of communism. It was a primal tribal loyalty to the Brotherhood of the Green Beret. What happened next explains the impossible data points the NVA were struggling to reconcile. The NVA had reported a figure sprinting into the kill zone unarmed. They assumed this was a sign of a new, fearless type of shock trooper. The reality was far more chaotic. As the extraction helicopters revved their engines, Benavidez didn't ask for permission. He didn't go to the armory to draw a weapon. He didn't put on a helmet or a flak jacket. He grabbed a field medical bag and ran toward the lead helicopter. "You're not going!" the pilot shouted over the rotor wash. "I'm going!" Benavidez yelled back. "That's my team!" He jumped aboard the high bird with nothing but a knife and a bag of bandages. This explains the NVA's confusion. They couldn't understand why the ghost wasn't firing back initially. He couldn't. He was unarmed. When the helicopter reached the kill zone, the pilot hesitated. The ground fire was too intense. The air was solid with green tracers. Benavidez didn't wait for a touchdown. He realized that if the helicopter tried to land, it would be destroyed. He jumped. He leaped from the hovering helicopter, falling 10 feet into the scrub brush. The impact alone would have stunned a normal man. Benavidez rolled, stood up, and began the 75-yard sprint that the NVA sniper had watched in disbelief. It was during this sprint that the American solution revealed itself. It wasn't technology. It was adrenaline fueled by a specific type of madness found only in elite units. As he ran, an AK-47 round slammed into his right leg. The NVA observers saw him stumble and keep running. They attributed this to a pain-suppressing drug. The reality was that Benavidez simply refused to acknowledge the injury. His brain had locked onto a single objective: get to the team. When he reached the perimeter, the scene was a slaughterhouse. The team leader was dead. The radio operator was dead. Every single man was wounded. The morale was shattered. They were waiting to die. Benavidez didn't offer them sympathy. He offered them violence. He grabbed an AK-47 from a dead enemy soldier, confirming the NVA report that he used their own weapons, and began to return fire. He moved from man to man, dragging them, slapping them awake, injecting morphine, and screaming orders. He essentially became the external hard drive for the unit's will to survive. He replaced their fear with his own aggression. For the next 6 hours, the secret project operated at maximum capacity. The NVA command had sent a battalion to kill 12 men. Benavidez made those 12 men fight like 100. He called in airstrikes with a precision that baffled the enemy. The NVA wondered how a man could coordinate jets while under heavy fire. The answer lay in Benavidez's training. He was a forward air controller. He understood the language of the pilots. He brought the 4 Phantoms in so close that the napalm singed the eyebrows of the survivors. He used the enemy's proximity against them, turning the jungle into a furnace that only his team could survive, because they were at the very center of the storm. The injuries began to mount, documenting the impossible durability the Soviets would later analyze. 1,430 hours. Shrapnel from a grenade shreds his back. 1,500 hours. A bullet shatters his jaw. 1,545 hours. He is clubbed in the head with the butt of a rifle. Any one of these injuries warranted a medevac priority 1. Combined, they spelled death. But Benavidez was operating on a plane of existence, where the body is just a tool, and tools can be used until they break. The climax of the American solution came when the extraction helicopter finally crashed. This was the moment the NVA moved in for the kill. Benavidez was pinned beneath the wreckage. He was bleeding from his eyes, his ears, and his mouth. An NVA soldier, seeing an easy kill, lunged at him with a bayonet. The blade went through Benavidez's left arm and out the other side. In that moment, the NVA soldier looked into the eyes of the ghost. He didn't see a machine. He saw a man possessed. Benavidez, with a bayonet through his arm, managed to grab the soldier's rifle, pull him close, and kill him with his combat knife. He then pushed himself up from the mud. He picked up an AK-47, and he started shooting again. This was the secret the Soviets could never replicate. They could build better tanks. They could build faster jets. But they could not manufacture the spirit of a man who, when stripped of everything weapons, support, and even his own physical integrity, decided that he was not done fighting. The source of the mystery was simply the refusal to accept the reality of defeat. But as the sun set and the second extraction helicopter finally managed to pull the survivors out of the fire, the cost of this supernatural performance became clear. Benavidez was dragged onto the floor of the helicopter. He was holding his intestines in with his hands. He had been shot, stabbed, and blown up over 30 times. He fell unconscious. As the helicopter lifted off, leaving the burning jungle and the stunned NVA battalion behind, the crew looked at the heap of bloody rags on the floor. They checked for a pulse. They found none. The ghost had finally died. Or so they thought. Loc Ninh Base Camp, May 2nd, 1968, 1800 hours. The sun had set, but the heat remained, radiating off the metal plating of the landing strip. The high bird touched down, its rotors slowly winding down to a mournful whine. The side doors opened, and the ground crew rushed forward. They were used to seeing blood. This was Vietnam in 1968, after all, but they recoiled at the sight inside the fuselage. The interior was painted red. It looked less like a vehicle of war and more like an abattoir. The medical teams began pulling the men out. The survivors of the 12-man team were battered, broken, but alive. They were rushed to the surgical tent. Then, they came to the man who had saved them. Master Sergeant Roy Benavidez was a ruin. His uniform was shredded. His skin was grey, the colour of wet ash. He was not breathing. His eyes were crusted shut with dried blood. The flight surgeon, exhausted and covered in gore, performed a quick triage. He checked for a pulse at the carotid artery. Nothing. He checked for breath. Nothing. "He's gone," the doctor said, his voice flat. "Tag him. This is the moment where the mystery of the ghost of Loch Ninh should have ended." The NVA had failed to kill him in the jungle, but biology had seemingly finished the job on the tarmac. Two orderlies lifted Benavidez's limp body onto a stretcher. They didn't rush him to surgery. They walked him over to the dead pile, a row of black, rubberized body bags waiting to be filled. This was the shock moment that would eventually filter back to intelligence agencies around the world. The Soviet analysts had hypothesized a soldier who could not be killed. In a way, they were right. As the orderly began to zip up the body bag, pulling the zipper past Benavidez's chest, something flickered in the darkness of Roy's consciousness. He was locked in a state of profound shock. He could hear the zipper. He could feel the plastic closing around him. He knew, with a terrifying clarity, that he was about to be sealed in and buried. He tried to move his arms. They wouldn't respond. He tried to scream. His jaw was broken. His mouth was full of blood and coagulated tissue. He was trapped in his own corpse. The zipper reached his chin. The doctor turned away to attend to the living. Benavidez summoned every last milligram of energy remaining in his cells. He couldn't speak. He couldn't wave. He did the only thing a dying animal could do to prove it still had a fight left. He gathered a mouthful of blood and saliva, and with a wet, gurgling cough, he spit it directly into the doctor's face. The doctor froze. He wiped the blood from his cheek and looked down. The corpse was looking back at him. "Get him to surgery!" the doctor screamed. "He's alive! Move! Move!" The dead pile erupted into chaos. They rushed Benavidez into the operating theatre. The surgery lasted for hours. The list of damages read like an autopsy report of a car crash victim. 37 separate puncture wounds from bayonets, bullets, and shrapnel. His intestines were exposed, his lungs were collapsed. But the heart kept beating. Meanwhile, on the other side of the border, the reveal was hitting the North Vietnamese army with a different kind of shock. The NVA commander walked the battlefield the next morning. He expected to find the remains of an American company. He expected to find the wreckage of tanks, or at least heavy machine gun emplacements. He found nothing but shell casings and blood. The intelligence officers counting the NVA dead stopped at numbers that made no sense. The 320th Division had lost hundreds of men. And when they reconstructed the battle, piecing together the sight lines and the shell craters, the horrifying truth settled in. There was no secret American battalion. There was no new tank. The entire NVA assault had been broken by one man with a knife and a borrowed rifle. This realization, the confrontation with the truth, was a bitter pill for the Soviet advisors. They had supplied the NVA with the best weaponry the Eastern Bloc could produce. They had trained them in the finest ambush tactics. And it had all been dismantled by the sheer, illogical willpower of a single American NCO. The Soviet response, in the years that followed, was a desperate attempt to systematize what Benavidez had done. They studied human performance under extreme duress. They tried to create training programs that mimicked the berserker state. But the response was futile. You cannot train a soldier to have his abdomen cut open and still carry a wounded comrade. That isn't training, that is character. The Soviets had spent millions of rubles trying to close the technology gap with the Americans stealing plans for the atomic bomb, the space shuttle, the fighter jets. But on May 2nd, 1968, they realized there was a spirit gap that no amount of espionage could bridge. As Benavidez lay in a hospital bed in Japan weeks later, finally stable, the American military moved to classify the details of the event. The full story was so violent, and the location, Cambodia, so politically sensitive, that the Medal of Honor process was stalled. It would take years for the full truth to come out. But the legend of the ghost traveled fast in the underground networks of intelligence. The Soviets knew. They knew that somewhere in the American ranks, there were men who simply refused to obey the laws of death. And that knowledge changed the calculus of the Cold War. If one man could stop a battalion, what would happen if the two superpowers truly went to war? The Pentagon, Washington, D.C., the Kremlin, Moscow. The decades following 1968, the dust settled over Loch Ninh, but the ripples of what happened in those 6 hours continued to disturb the strategic waters of the Cold War for years. When the final reports were typed up, stamped top secret, and filed away in the dusty archives of military history, they contained a set of statistics that seemed to mock the very concept of modern warfare. This brings us to the verdict, the killer statistic, that defines the anomaly of Roy Benavidez. On May 2nd, 1968, a single American soldier, armed initially with only a knife and a medical bag, engaged a reinforced North Vietnamese infantry battalion of approximately 1,000 men. He sustained 37 separate puncture wounds. He had a broken jaw, he had shattered lungs, he had lost nearly 2 quarts of blood. And yet, in the face of this biological devastation, he successfully evacuated 8 American soldiers and killed an estimated 30 enemy combatants in close-quarters combat. The math of the Cold War was supposed to be simple. Mass wins. The Soviet doctrine, exported to the NVA, was built on the idea that quantity has a quality all its own. If you throw enough steel and enough bodies at a problem, the problem disappears. Roy Benavidez proved that equation wrong. He proved that there is a variable the Soviet calculators could not account for, the indomitable will of a free man fighting for his brothers. This incident serves as a perfect microcosm for the ultimate failure of the Soviet system and the eventual triumph of the West. The Soviet military machine was designed for obedience. It was a top-down hierarchy where initiative was often punished. An NVA soldier would not have dared to jump out of a helicopter against orders to save a patrol that was already written off. The system did not allow for it. The American system, for all its flaws, was built on the concept of the individual. It was a system that produced men like Benavidez, men who could think, adapt, and act without waiting for permission from a commissar. Intelligence analysts who studied the engagement realized that the technology gap the Soviets feared was real, but it wasn't about microchips or jet engines. The United States possessed a cultural technology that the communist bloc could not replicate. They possessed a military culture that authorized the individual to be a hero. When the Soviets looked at the Benavidez file, they didn't just see a Superman, they saw a terrifying unpredictability. If every American soldier had the potential to become a Roy Benavidez under pressure, then no amount of planning could guarantee victory. The ghost of Loc Ninh became a psychological deterrent. It whispered to the enemy commanders that no matter how many guns they brought, they might still lose to one man who simply refused to die. But the story of Roy Benavidez had one final twist, a mystery that lasted for 13 years. Because the mission took place in Cambodia, a neutral country where US troops were technically not supposed to be, the details were buried. Benavidez received the Distinguished Service Cross, a high honor, but not the Medal of Honor he deserved. The military bureaucracy, fearful of a political scandal, tried to erase the impossible event. Benavidez went back to the United States. He lived in constant pain. The 37 wounds left him with a body that was a roadmap of violence. He battled the bureaucracy for his disability benefits. He lived a quiet life, a humble man who never bragged about the day he held off a battalion. However, his commanding officer, Colonel Ralph Drake, knew the truth. He knew that what Benavidez had done was the single most courageous act of the war. He spent years fighting to upgrade the award. But there was a problem. The rules required a living witness to corroborate the details. The NVA had killed almost everyone. The survivors Benavidez saved were either dead from their wounds or scattered to the winds. It wasn't until 1980, 12 years later, that the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. A man named Brian O'Connor, the radio man from that doomed patrol, was found living in the Fiji Islands. He had been on vacation in Australia, read a newspaper article about the quest to honor Benavidez, and realized, that's the man who saved my life. O'Connor wrote a 10-page report. He described the ghost in vivid detail. He confirmed the bayonet fight. He confirmed the airstrikes. He confirmed the spitting of blood. On February 24th, 1981, in the courtyard of the Pentagon, President Ronald Reagan finally set the record straight. As he read the citation, even the president, a man used to Hollywood scripts, paused. He looked at the audience and said, "If the story of his heroism were a movie script, you would not believe it." The Soviet observers monitoring the news that day finally got their answer. The ghost had a name. He was standing there, in a dress blue uniform, stiff with scar tissue, wearing the blue ribbon of the Medal of Honor. The Cold War is often remembered as a chess game played by old men in suits, moving nuclear missiles across a map. We think of the Berlin Wall, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the space race. But the true reality of that conflict was decided in the mud, in the jungles, and in the shadows. It was decided by the raw, visceral collision of two ideologies. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. Its economy failed, its government dissolved, and its military rusted away. The system of the collective could not sustain itself. But the legacy of May 2nd, 1968, endures. It serves as a permanent reminder that in the calculus of war, the most dangerous weapon is not a tank or a jet or a bomb. The most dangerous weapon is a single human heart that has decided, against all logic and reason, that it will not stop beating. Master Sergeant Roy Benavidez died on November 29, 1998. But in the annals of military history, and in the nightmares of those who tried to kill him, he remains immortal. He is the ghost who walked through fire and proved that the human spirit is the only superpower that truly matters.